Now we're still on page 10 of the owner's manual. We're going to go ahead and install the upper guard and splitter assembly, or what we call the riving knife. And this saw has a really nice guard. A lot of people are tempted to not use a saw with these guards. These have been designed very, very well to make them very easy to use and to leave them installed in place. You'll see that this has the riving knife attached with it. It has the anti-kickback paws here, and then swing away shields that are in the front. In order to install this, we're going to go ahead and remove the upper cover here with what we call the throat plate. There's a little twist knob right here, a finger hole right here, and this will lift right out and set to the side. Now make sure that anytime that you're working inside your saw, when you're doing a blade change or doing any work near your saw blade at all, to have the power disconnected. I've left it disconnected right now, and anytime that you work around the blade, you should always leave it disconnected. Now is also a good time to check and make sure that your blade is tight. It should be tight when it's shipped from the factory, but if it's not, it's always a good time to check it. You should always check and make sure your blade is tight before using the saw. Now before installing the guard, I want to go ahead and lift this mechanism all the way up. Let me crank it to the up position, and we'll do that at the front handle. And while we're up front here, let's go ahead and remove the little plastic cover. This is the lock handle that we'll use later when we're doing a tilt adjustment. Loosen the lock knob that's in the middle. That loosens the tension. Now we can go ahead and crank the blade up by rotating the knob clockwise. Now that we've got the blade and arbor assembly in the up position, you can see that your saw ships with a blade. It's got a standard carbide tipped blade on it. It also has just a standard riving knife, and in many cases, for a lot of cuts, you'll have just the riving knife in place. For other cuts, you'll have the splitter with the guard assembly and the kickback paws in place. And this is handy for you doing long rips and things of that nature. Now you should never use the saw without the splitter or the riving knife in place. Both of these items are designed for your safety. If you use your saw without these, what could happen is you could have kickback. And kickback is caused when your piece of wood is coming through the saw and the back edge of the blade picks up the wood and lifts it forward and has kickback, and it could be very dangerous and cause injuries. So you always want to make sure that you've got your riving knife in place or that you've got your guard and splitter in place. Now, to remove the riving knife and install the splitter, there's a lock knob that's right inside here. You simply give this a counterclockwise twist, and there's a spring on it. You can hear that spring, and as you loosen that up, give it a couple twists, push it over to the side, you'll feel that the riving knife comes out. And you can drop the splitter assembly right on here. It has the slot right here. This will go in place. And be careful as you set it down so you don't hurt your fingers on the blade. That'll bottom out and then tighten it down in a clockwise motion. Now be careful. This nut that is on here is aluminum, and it doesn't require much force. It just simply snugs down in place, and you can strip it out and over tighten it if you crank down on it or put a wrench on it. It's meant to be finger tight. You should just snug it and let it go. When the splitter is on and in place, these guards should swing forward. You should have the high part in the front, and they lift up like this as you slide wood through. And you can install the throat plate with this splitter assembly in place by sliding it from the front toward the back and then latching it in place. And that's how you change from a riving knife over to your splitter and guard assembly. Now, if you're having trouble removing the riving knife, you can always use your arbor wrench to come down and to loosen the nut here for the riving knife, but never use your wrench to tighten it down. It should only be installed finger tight. I really like this blade guard assembly here. It has a couple of different functions. Of course, it acts as a splitter. It has the anti-kickback paws, and it's got the swing away guard assembly on the front here. And it's pretty versatile. It actually has a couple of different positions. When you have it installed in this position, you'll see that the anti-kickback paws ride on this little tray on the back here, and that way they don't wear through and dig into the table. If you need to get down here and make any adjustments, or if you want to use these anti-kickback paws but not have the guard in place, you can simply loosen this knob on the top, and with this in the loose position, you don't have to remove it all the way. You can lift up and forward on this assembly and it will come off. And this will leave your anti-kickback paws in place and have the guard assembly out of the way. And this is good for doing ripping that might be thicker than your guard will allow, and allow you to do other various cuts. The paw on the right-hand side, and it's the right-hand side as you're looking from the front of the saw, is designed to kind of tilt away from the blade a little bit, and that allows you to go through and make tilted cuts with this assembly in place, and you'll see it has a bigger pad on this side here as well. Now the main difference between the splitter with the kickback paws and the riving knife is the riving knife is designed so that you can make non-through cuts and leave it in place, and it actually will ride just slightly below the level of the tooth. If you refer to your owner's manual, it'll show you the adjustment on that. We're going to go back and reinstall the riving knife onto the saw, and we'll look at that adjustment process. And what we're looking at is that the riving knife will actually set just slightly below the level of the tooth. And you want to be between 1 millimeter and 5 millimeters for this adjustment. You don't want to have this knife too low, otherwise you don't have the protection that the knife provides. If you have it too tall, you can't make a blind cut with the blade and the riving knife in place. You also want to observe the back here and maintain an even distance or an even gap on the back. If you do need to adjust it, we can loosen this bracket and move it. This one comes very closely set from the factory, and you probably shouldn't have to go through and make any adjustments. Right now is a good time to also level our throat plate, and so we'll reinstall the throat plate on the saw. When you're leveling the throat plate, it's a good idea just to have it in place. Make sure that the back tabs are set in place. Those will lock in. The front tab will go through and keep it from rattling loose as you're using it. And what we want to do is kind of level this all the way around. There's 4 little screws right here. Let's grab an Allen wrench and set those screws to the proper height. The Allen wrench is supplied with the saw. And I'm just going to level these off to where it's at or just below the level of the table. You don't want to have it too low, and you don't want to have it too tall. If it's too tall, your wood will catch on it as you're feeding it through, and it makes it tough to feed stock through effortlessly. Okay. Now that I've got those adjustments set, I just want to go back and check. Drag a straight edge across that, right where these leveling screws are. And what we're just checking is to make sure that we don't have anything protruding up so that we don't catch a board as we're sliding it through the throat plate. We want to make sure we're not catching on the back edge of the saw or on the front edge of the throat insert. Now that we've got that adjusted, this can come on and off very easily and be set back in place. And those little screws have a little bit of Loctite on them. They're not going to move on you, and those should stay set for the life of the saw. If you have to make any adjustments, they're pretty easy to set. Just use the Allen wrench. Again, we talked about tightening up the blade. You've got 2 wrenches to tighten up the blade. The nice thing is you've got one for the inside, and we'll use the open end on the arbor side. On the outside edge here where the nut is, we're going to use the closed end portion. We'll rotate this down and just make sure that the blade is nice and snug. And it's a standard right-handed thread on this nut, right-handed thread to tighten it. Now, while we have the blade in the up position and looking down inside of the saw, you'll see on the inside that we've got a baffle or a shroud on the inside. And this is going to capture almost all of the sawdust that is going down on the inside of the cabinet. And it also has a slot right here that evacuates out the cabinet, so it's split on the inside of the port. It's a 4-inch port on the outside. It has the hose that goes up for the shroud, and it has the bottom slot to evacuate the cabinet. And we'll look at that from the inside in just a moment. Now that we've ensured that the blade is tight, I'm going to reinstall the throat insert. We may have this on and off several different times during the setup. One thing I like to check at this spot is to make sure that my miter slots are exactly parallel with the blade. Once the blade is tight on the saw, you can go through and check this, and there's a number of ways to check it. You want to check it from the tooth or from the blade, and you want to remain consistent coming over here. Picking one tooth on the saw, sometimes I'll take a Sharpie pen and I'll circle one tooth on the blade and use that as a reference point to come over and check my miter slot. And there are several ways to do this. You can do this with a tape measure that has fine graduation marks on it, and what you'll do is you'll come over, bring it up to a tooth like this, and come over and check it against a mark. If you find that it's handy to have a piece of wood in here, you can slide a piece of wood up in here to reference the inside portion of this machined slot. This is a standard 3/8 by 3/4 inch T-slot that's in the table. And this is the slots that our miter gauge rides in, or if you have a sled that goes on your table, it'll ride in these same slots. So we're going to pick a tooth. I'm going to come over and make this measurement right here. And then what I'll do is I'll follow that same tooth all the way around to the back side. And again, make sure your saw is unplugged. Pick up that same tooth on the back side and check it to make sure that your miter slots are exactly parallel with the blade. If they're off at all, there's an adjustment you can do, and it should be done right now before you do any other adjustments. The adjustment is to take the table and loosen it. There's 3 bolts that we're going to show you on the bottom, and take the table and adjust it this way to make sure that the miter slots are parallel with the blade. Now you can do it with a tape measure, and if you've got a good eye and a finely graduated tape measure, you can make this measurement. You can also do this. They have some sliders that go in here that have a feeler gauge that goes over here, and you can use that as well. You just want to make sure that these are set up just as parallel as you can possibly get them for your saw. Let's have a look at the bolts on the bottom. I don't need to adjust this one, by the way. This one came in very tight, but I'm going to show you where those adjustment bolts are. There's 3 of them. Let's look underneath the table at those bolts. If you look just behind the hand wheel on the left-hand side of the saw, you're going to see one of them, and there's a nice little cutout so you can reach that bolt. There's another one just like this on the opposite side of the side, on the right-hand side of the cabinet. This will use a number 13 wrench, and you can come in here and loosen this. There's also one more of these bolts that's located on the back side of the saw that we'll show you. You'll simply loosen these bolts to get the table adjusted. Don't loosen them too much because you don't want the table to move around too freely as you're making this adjustment. You'll go back, square those miter slots up to the blade, snug these bolts down, double check it, and we'll be ready for the next step.